Professor Robert Fogelin is our guest panelist in this program. He is chairman of the Department of Philosophy at Dartmouth College, and he specializes in epistemology, ethics, and philosophy of language. He has published extensively, and his recent books include Hume's Skepticism in the Treatise on Human Nature, Wittgenstein, Figuratively Speaking, and his newest, Pyrrhonian Reflections on Knowledge and Justification. In this program, the panelists scrutinize Professor Quine's epistemology in detail. In response, he clearly explains his concept of naturalized epistemology and his web of belief, and he answers the classical skeptical challenges. Next, Quine's views on the problems of induction and on the status of epistemic norms are considered. Finally, Professor Quine's naturalism is explored, that is, the belief that science is the only road to knowledge. We now join the panel in Cambridge, Massachusetts. This module is broadly entitled Epistemology, and joining Professor Quine for this discussion are Robert Fogelin, Professor of Philosophy from Dartmouth College, Paul Horwich, Professor of Philosophy at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, and Martin Davies, Wild Reader of Mental Philosophy at Oxford University. When asked earlier in my interview if he attached any primacy of importance to any domain of philosophical inquiry, Professor Quine unreservedly said epistemology, and his scheme in particular, epistemology naturalized. In this module, we shall discuss other important Quinean theses which are linked to naturalized epistemology, including the web of belief, holism, underdetermination, and naturalism.
Well, Professor Quine, about naturalized epistemology, you say epistemology in its new setting is contained in natural science as a chapter of psychology. Could you just say a little bit about this new kind of epistemology which forms part of natural science?
I'm thinking of it as confronting, dealing with the question of how, on the basis of what little sensory input we have from the world, according to the testimony of scientists themselves, it's just the particles and light rays that strike our sensory surfaces. In view of the what would seem to be the paucity of this input, how is it that we arrive at the voluminous and successful, useful scientific theory that we do? Useful in the sense of predicting some more input. And this is, I think, a question that should puzzle anyone and everyone, quite apart from reductionist projects in epistemology, quite apart from transcendental philosophy, but simply as a question in the real world, a question regarding a species of mammals, and more particularly a question, therefore, in psychology.
Well, if we think about epistemology as a chapter of psychology, I can see that if we're thinking about gaining knowledge by perception, the psychologist and the physiologist of vision would have an important role to play. If we're thinking about children learning new concepts, I can see that the developmental psychologist would have an important role to play. Again, if we're thinking about learning a language, well, then the theoretical linguist would be the person to turn to. What puzzles me is, what would the contribution of a professional philosopher be to naturalized epistemology?
This brings up again my rubbing out of the demarcation between philosophy and science, or the rest of science. It's, I think, what's characteristically philosophical about it is the nature of the question itself, the kind of curiosity that raises the question. That's part of it, and part of it is the crucial role in dealing with the question that's played by the theory of scientific verification, the role of experimentation, the nature of scientific evidence, which one does even more or less traditionally think of, I believe, as normative philosophy.
Sure. Could you just say just a word more about how the philosopher contributes without having to become a theoretical linguist or a psychologist or a physiologist?
One can get quite a long way, maybe pretty much all the way, just by putting aside preconceptions as best he can and thinking in terms of pretty much common sense knowledge. But then help can be freely drawn without fear of circularity from the results of the scientists themselves, and certainly from psychology, neurology. One can hope for more and more light, and again, quite decidedly from artificial intelligence. And there's no longer scruples about respecting a boundary between philosophy and science.
Indeed, no boundary disputes, but this would seem to suggest that the philosopher who'd taken full heed of your message would be very much a person who engaged in reportage about these various sciences, linguistics, psychology, physiology, artificial intelligence, that philosophy articles written with this fully in mind would be just shot through with reportage of these kinds of results. And indeed, we see this increasingly so today.
I think so, and I think of Dan Dennett.
Indeed.
Just that, yes. Mm-hmm.
Such a fine example.
Yes.
Okay. You've suggested that we think of our collection of scientific theories as constituting a sort of holistic, organic system. You've described it as a web of belief. Could you say something more about what you had in mind by this metaphor?
Well, I think the central idea is holism, the interlocking of our various principles, the hopelessness in general of testing and corroborating or refuting a hypothesis by an observation, a single hypothesis, by trying to deduce an operational test of what should happen in the event of in case of some observable event, what further observable event should follow from it. That implication of the one event by the other, the one observation by the other, would be implied, if one were to test a hypothesis, implied by the hypothesis itself. The hypothesis would be implying this conditional. But usually some simply stated hypothesis isn't adequate to deduce logically such a test. It takes help of many auxiliary hypotheses, and normally it's a chunk, what I call a chunk of theory of critical mass, mass sufficient to imply what I call a observation conditional. So there's that's the way holism comes in, so I think of these various laws, truths or purported truths of science, scientific pronouncements, as interlocking scientifically, interlocking logically, and it's forming a web, the periphery of which is observation, or observation sentences, since it's a web of sentences.
What principles govern the way in which the web changes, evolves through time?
There will be some hypothesis that we're wondering about. We have to take others' hypotheses along with it to get a critical mass for testing. And when the test gives a negative result in the experiment, that means that we've got to change something. usually we've had a suspicious hypothesis in mind, and that's the one we'll change. But it might be that it's a good one and that there was something wrong with the one or another of the auxiliaries that we brought in to make a critical mass, to imply our conditional. Let's suppose that second event it turns out to be the situation. Then we have to drop that old belief. We can keep the new hypothesis. Dropping the old belief isn't so simple. We also have to comb through our whole relevant part of science and weed out all the various beliefs which, taken together, would imply that one. So there's just a pretty widespread logical shakeup, and it's a matter of reverberation through this web.
These principles that govern the evolution of the web of belief, that is, the principle that our theories be consistent with the observations in the periphery, the desire that the overall system be as simple as possible, and I suppose the constraint that we want to just as few things as possible, consistent with the other two constraints. These sorts of principles, will they be themselves principles within the web as well as determining how the web evolves, or am I taking the metaphor too literally?
Well, I have since in the years since Web of Belief came out, I have a somewhat more explicit view of these things. I think of such canons or counsels as economy and conservatism as counsels in the framing of hypotheses, because this I'm thinking, and this is quite in line with Karl Popper. In fact, I'm thinking of science as a matter of picking promising hypotheses and testing them. These are norms. They're norms for the heuristic norms for picking a good hypothesis, one that we're less likely, we feel, to waste our time on, and furthermore, one which would be more fruitful and lead on to further speculation of a promising kind if it turned out to be true. So I think of this as normative, normative naturalistic epistemology, and therefore as a branch of engineering, you might say, that is the engineering of hypothesis making, the engineering, in fact, of scientizing.
Are you saying that the requirement to choose theories that are consistent with the observational periphery is merely a heuristic?
No.
No?
No. No, that, I think that rather is what science is. And people could even differ in their taste for science and prefer a sort of a dream world. Well, there's no accounting for taste, that's all right. But if it's going to be science, I think the touchstone is just that it's a matter of hypotheses which mostly, I must say, cannot directly be tested. I think there are a great many useful accepted scientific statements, properly accepted, which can't even be tested empirically in company with supporting hypotheses. That is to say, a statement such that there's no critical mass of hypotheses, including that principle, which wouldn't still be critical if you took that principle, that hypothesis away. So it's one that doesn't add, doesn't help build up a critical mass even, not even indirectly testable. And I think science in the broad sense, which, Wissenschaft, including history, including soft sciences, all this, I think taking that whole domain, all of which is worth keeping, that maybe this situation is more frequent than otherwise, and I think it should be. I don't think it's a criticism, because I think that such conjectures, which we made by analogy, considerations of symmetry, just plausible extrapolations, these suggest further hypotheses, some of which it turns out can be tested directly or indirectly.
Yeah, I see.
And a lot of mathematics is certainly this category, as well as a lot of perhaps most history and most anthropology, perhaps. And all.
I have another somewhat technical question about the model. Is there any room in it for the idea of degrees of belief or degrees of conviction? Is there some way in which this idea of degree of belief matches up with the notion of something being closer to the periphery or closer to the center of the web?
I think of degree of belief, of course, as vital, and I think that's the important concept rather than knowledge. That knowledge is just way off at one extreme of that continuum. But as for proximity to the periphery of the web, no. Sometimes that's the reason for strong belief, and quite a legitimate reason, namely proximity to the web. You're getting over and over, you're getting observable corroboration of the belief. But then at the other end, way in the interior of this whole web, the most abstract and theoretical things of all, again, well, mathematics, which is part of it, part of the web. I put it all in there, and that commands the same conviction as things at the web, at the edge.
I'm wondering how to put together, I guess, and this question is about how one puts together the idea of having a single web of belief in which certain sentences, say, are form an interconnected whole with some of them at the periphery, some of them towards the middle. Can that be put together with the idea that, in fact, one's epistemic state is one in which degrees of belief are assigned to a certain degree of belief is assigned to a sentence. Perhaps 1 minus that degree of belief is assigned to its negation. So are both of those sentences, the sentence and its negation, somewhere in the web? Or which one of them is in the web?
Only the believed ones.
But if we're regarding that notion of believed as an oversimplification, and we're moving to degrees of belief, then how does the single web survive? The web of belief.
I would think, as far as this web metaphor goes, I don't think it does clarify degree of belief, but this should contain all the beliefs at one time, and these would be the strong beliefs and weak ones, but the degree of belief would depend on, perhaps typically on two factors. One, the proximity to the peripheries, a strong one. But then another one is that if it's fairly central to the web in this sense, not necessarily being mathematical, although that's an extreme case, but fairly central in the sense that a lot seems to depend on it. Oh, such a belief as that air expands when it's heated, and it has so many applications and the corroborations of various applications of further things that you derive from it. That's apt to be a firmer belief, because all the good use you're making of it in parts of science that seem to be doing all right, even if you haven't tested all of it as much as one might. There would be a factor that leads to a strength of belief. And then, of course, another factor which is not to be encouraged is wishful thinking. William James's will to believe.
You started talking about holism, but then when you gave the example for testing the hypothesis, you used phrases like critical mass, that we obviously don't go to the total system. Is it part of your position that the total system has to form some sort of coherent whole, or could there be regions or neighborhoods, or I guess what Morton White calls corporations?
Oh, well, the way I see that is that it can be just as a matter of degree now, very disjointed, and is. But when you consider what it all has in common, the logic applies across the board. Mathematics does, and in half of the special sciences, special subdivisions at least, quite a lot of use is probably made of it. Quite a lot it contributes. Mathematical principles come in as components of these critical masses, along with what people think of as empirical hypotheses. Because again, I tend to rub out the demarcation between mathematics and natural science. Numbers are constantly turning up as values of variables along with physical objects, and these things all join into the logical implications together. I think of logic in a more limited sense, and then mathematics as set theory and on out, which is more of a fabrication. But logic in the strict sense, what is ordinarily formulated in the first order predicate calculus, is shared by all of our beliefs, all of our science. And so I think of it as a web, but with a lot of, the way it is now, a lot of rather tenuously linked and internally dense portions. And it's furthermore, I think of it as a worthy ideal of science to go on integrating it more and more.
The unified science ideal is still
unified science, right?
still active. Actually, this makes a nice transition. You talked about the a priori knowledge, and the theory is that these things are whole. I take it the ones that are near the core. But there's another part of your theory that I take it is that revisability, that anything in principle is revisable. Now, I think some people would find that just simply hard to take.
Well, I think I rather agree. I think nowadays it seems to me at best an uninteresting legalism. Yes, you could take an extreme line of even violating perhaps a bit of logic itself, or certainly some quite basic mathematics, and at the price of that, make some things come out false that anybody would be inclined to say were almost indubitably true. So I don't like to think of, I don't think that really in a serious sense can be maintained that the whole of science is the tribunal. But the important thing, the important insight of Duham's is that, although maybe he would say that, I think the important insight is that in general it takes quite a chunk of science to imply a observation conditional and or an observation categorical, as I call them, and those chunks of science which have critical mass are I think, from a pragmatic point of view are really what count. But on the other hand, there's the unifying of the whole of science by its underlying logic and mathematics, and also tremendous ranges of common sense truths that don't belong to any science.
So what's your attitude then if somebody wants to, say, start tinkering with things, even in the propositional logic, say distribution laws, for the sake of quantum mechanics? Is that, it seems to me on one occasion you thought that might be even possible, an example of changing something at the core.
Well, oh yes, you can. You can do that. I still agree that it's something to be taken seriously, and I'm prepared to be persuaded by physicists at some point that it's a good idea. But this wouldn't mean discarding our. It certainly wouldn't require us to discard our logic as it stands. It would mean, at worst, a kind of revision that Einstein made of Newton's mechanics. If the speed isn't too high, if the terrain isn't too steep or hilly, the old Euclidean geometry is still the thing, and Newtonian mechanics still works, so that you can accommodate the old-fashioned Newtonian mechanics as the consequent of a conditional in which the antecedent is these limiting conditions. And that would be true also in the case of quantum mechanics. If it turned out that the quantum theory could be made, could be made to seem much more intelligible and less weird by bringing in such an already rather weird logic, so be it. But then for everyday purposes, or for macroscopic physics even, perhaps, if that cleavage or interface survives between the quantum level and the upper one, there would be this tacit antecedent to our statements, after which all our law of excluded middle, notably, and the rest would still be in force. So I wouldn't separate logic and mathematics from the rest of science in that respect.
There's something that puzzles me about revisability, although perhaps this is more a question about how your views have been received, more of a question about that than about exactly what you meant. My puzzle is this: people attribute to you a thesis of revisability as if this were an innovation, as if this was one of the doctrines that distinguished you from people like Carnap and the positivists that you were reacting against. But isn't it true that just as you say that any sentence that forms part of our theory formulation might be abandoned for the sake of getting a better theory formulation, someone like Carnap would have said exactly the same thing. It's just that he, unlike you, would have said that sometimes when you do that, you're changing the meanings of the words. But as far as the thesis of revisability itself goes, he would have been endorsed it.
That's right. And furthermore, Carnap even cited and praised Duhem's holism. But my complaint has been that he didn't carry through with what seemed to me to be the consequences and implications, which would part of which would be the questioning of the notion of analyticity and meaning. And, yes, I certainly haven't felt that was new or revolutionary.
But as you've been speaking about not pushing too hard on the ideal of revisability, it begins to occur to me that we've got a number of types of propositions which are not really nodes in this web, but are performing some other kind of role. First of all, we had the sorts of overarching principles of simplicity and consistency, which Paul mentioned earlier. And now we have logical and mathematical principles are, as you say, providing a unifying role. They're establishing various kinds of linkages within the web, and with certain exceptions, it seemed that here you were not going to press revisability. So it does seem that we could ask this question: what's the difference between the original web of belief picture and the alternative picture, which would simply involve a bifurcation? There's the empirical propositions of the sciences, and then which are all up for revision, and then there's this bunch of principles which apparently are not de facto up for revision, things like the ideal of simplicity and the ideal of consistency and logic and mathematics. Why haven't we in fact here got just the sort of bifurcation which people have taken you anyway to be doing away with?
Yes. Now, to begin with, take the matter of simplicity and conservatism and theories. These I think of as heuristic canons in the engineering of scientific work, and so you might think of these as imperatives rather than indicatives. But there'd be corresponding indicatives, and these would be sentences capable, quite vague, but also quite capable of being contested or being false, of this sort, that your chances of getting a hypothesis that's really worth testing and apt to be fruitful if it comes out true are enhanced by considering by economy, by not departing more than you need to from our past theory, not upsetting the apple cart. Also, considerations of symmetry, maybe that goes under simplicity. So, like any council of strategy or engineering, there's a corresponding statement of expected consequences of an act. The case of logic is different. Let's take logic in the what I think of as really the proper sense of the word, namely elementary logic, as distinct from set theory. Here we have really the ideal case of analyticity. And in fact, in the definition that I suggested of analyticity in roots of reference is a perfect case of it. Namely, the suggestion there was, if a speaker learns the truth of a sentence in his native language by learning to use one of the words in it, that qualifies the sentence as analytic. And then refine the definition to make it deductively closed. That is, consequences of analytic sentences we'll also call analytic, and so on. This applies to perfection to the logical particles, doesn't it? I mean, we learn or. We learn that if you you say P or Q, some sentence of that form, and then in the course of things you deny P and you deny Q, and don't agree that you've changed your mind, you haven't yet learned to use the word or. You've misused the word. The word and, obviously, if you say P and Q but not P, you've misused the word. And there's no, at that level, there's no distinction between logical error and error in language. And so, and this, no doubt, is the kind of thing Carnap and others have had in mind when they have made use of had thought of the notion of analyticity as being so transparent, it's fine. The trouble is, you try to extend it to the point, the concept of analyticity, to the point where it has some real power in epistemological clarifications, and I say you've lost track of criteria and can't draw the line. We never remember how we learn sentences, except that we don't need to remember this, these obvious logical cases, because it just stands to reason that must be the way. But farther along, we don't. So that's the way I'd answer that part of your set of examples.
Good, thank you. Maybe we can move in a somewhat different direction. Traditional theory of knowledge has often been a response to skeptical challenges. And in some ways, your view is a response to skeptical challenges, except you've got this arresting idea that skeptical challenges are scientific challenges, and they're resolved by scientific means, with the example of the or, which I think is what'd be interesting to see what's your view of the traditional, I mean, how you respond to the sort of the standard old chestnut examples, whether they aren't genuine challenges at all, or in fact they can be resolved. I suppose probably one of the oldest skeptical challenges was the infinite regress of justification, that it turns out if you produce any sort of a justification, there's always going to be a demand for more, and this seems either to lead off into an infinite regress, or into a bad circle, or into arbitrary assumption. Now what to say?
Well, now let's consider how justification would go. Typically, we think that this stands to reason because, and then we cite some other related consideration that people would agree to, and people would turn out to agree to an implication of the one by the other, and it passes the responsibility back to these further grounds, and so it regresses. But there is a cutoff point, and that comes in the experimental test of a critical mass of theory.
Now, when the cutoff point comes, it just comes with the observation statements.
Yes.
So it has something of a look of foundationalism about it.
It does.
Yeah.
Yes.
So that's right. Well, that's straightforward. Let's try another skeptical doubt. I suppose the other standard one around is various Cartesian doubts. I don't mean just the idea that we have to wipe the board clean, but that we're going to withhold our judgment. If we can think of some possibility, if that possibility holds, then we're going to, and then we don't know. Then we have to have some argument to remove the possibility. And then we get deceiving geniuses, or we get brains and vats, and so on. Now, to my knowledge, you don't talk about those sorts of things very much.
Well, my attitude towards these is the same as my attitude towards more commonplace situations where the thing isn't quite so unthinkable from a or naive point of view. Namely, I would think in terms of naturalistic plausibility. What we know, what we believe anyway, firmly believe, but always, of course, science is corrigible and fallible, is that it would really be an implausible achievement to, at this stage anyway, to rig up such a brain, and so I don't think that I am one. I think there's the same answer to same sort of answer to the question of whether how do we know that we're awake, and we have these familiar, ordinary ways of being persuaded of that. I mean, the various things that we remember, and not running into surprises as the day goes on, and I wouldn't claim absolute conclusiveness of either, but then I'm not claiming absolute conclusiveness of anything in science.
So your strategy is not to declare these problems somehow illegitimate, meaningless, and so on. You treat them pretty much the same way you do the ore and the water, namely they are empirical questions.
That's it.
And they're straightforward empirical answers.
Exactly. Yeah.
That's very good.
Professor Quine, one way of hearing that reply is as saying it's really just massively implausible that these skeptical hypotheses obtain. So the skeptic must surely be proceeding by insisting upon some artificially high standard. I just wondered if we can try running the question again and see whether this response carries over. Think of the way that the skeptical problem is raised, for example, by Barry Stroud in his book, The Philosophical Significance of Skepticism, where he tries, I think, to be very naturalistic. That's to say, we observe our actual practice of talking about knowledge, and we find that there are principles there which are perfectly good workaday principles. Everybody seems to agree that if we're actually dreaming, then even if we're fortunate enough to come up with true beliefs, they wouldn't count as knowledge on that occasion, or wouldn't count as knowledge in virtue of being arrived at on that occasion. So it seems that dreaming is something which does count against knowing workaday propositions like I'm sitting in a chair, wearing a green tie, holding a clipboard, and so on. So the principle which is then suggested is, in order to know such workaday facts, I need to be able to rule out the dreaming hypothesis. And then Stroud goes on, by way of giving an elaboration of Descartes' own argument, once that principle's been granted, that in order to know workaday empirical propositions, you need to be able to rule out the dreaming hypothesis, then the challenge becomes unanswerable. Because, of course, we could imagine tests for deciding whether we're dreaming or not. I'd need to know that I'm sitting in front of a sleep meter and that it's pointing to awake rather than asleep. But of course that's put under threat by the very principle which we've granted. In order to know workaday propositions, you need to be able to rule out already the dreaming hypothesis. So suppose the skeptical problem is put in those terms. How do you respond then?
In general, whether it's a question of dreaming or illusion, any sorts of reasons for doubting our scientific conclusions, that it's a holistic matter of just pursuing our hypotheses all together, or our beliefs, and our beliefs come in various stages and of degrees of strength, and being prepared for surprises, being less prepared for surprises the greater the surprises are, naturally. And the checkpoints are there in observation, and those are the only checkpoints. And we have had surprises in the past. The dissolution of the Soviet Union was a good example recently, and we might have taken it as implausible. We saw the headline, and especially in some irresponsible tabloid, and then time went on. We found, well, to our surprise, there it is. I think that's the way it goes, and so I think perhaps the way to look at this is that I'm not really answering the skeptic. I'm simply allowing this skepticism, but that the skeptical doubts, the deeper they run, are the correspondingly less plausible, less disturbing, because we do proceed by the general center of gravity of our overall system, our overall beliefs, if we depart from the web example at this point.
I wanted to ask you whether this is a fair statement of your position on skepticism. To the skeptic who says, you don't really know that we're all sitting here in this room, because after all there are certain logically possible hypotheses that would be inconsistent with it, that you cannot preclude. Your answer is that you're not really interested in the concept of knowledge. You think it's defective and used in muddled ways. to the skeptic who says, you have no reason to think, you have no reason to be confident that there are people in this room because of such and such because of the possibility that we all might be dreaming, you answer, no, that's not the case. We do have reason because the hypothesis that we're all dreaming is scientifically implausible.
Yes, exactly. That's the way I look at it.
So would it be fair to characterize your response in this way, that although you accept that if you're actually unfortunate enough to be dreaming, that does indeed rule out your gaining knowledge at that time, that you don't accept the move from that to, in order to know workaday facts, you need to be able antecedently to rule out the dreaming hypothesis? There is indeed logical space between those two claims, and it seems that you're just rejecting the move from the one to the other.
Well, yes, I think I should agree to that, that I'm ruling that dream hypothesis out in the sense that I dismiss it as very unlikely. And I think that's the sort of mood in which we do our thinking generally. There's plenty to worry about in the way of things that could interfere with the with our hypotheses and show that we're wrong in them, and we worry about the likeliest ones.
Would it be fair to say that your answer is grounded in a kind of theory of inquiry, a theory of knowledge, what honest inquiry looks like?
Very good, yes.
And,
yes.
And these doubts simply don't have a place in honest inquiry.
Yes.
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 And if, to the extent that they're raised, they're dismissed almost immediately from the rest of the things you know. They're just not. At some place you talk about, that the genuine questions don't demand feigned doubt, which I think is important. That in some way, with feigned doubt, this is not the sort of issue that concerns your kind of project.
Yes, and I like that move to inquiry because the notion of knowledge does bother me, in that because of its absoluteness, and I like to think rather in terms of a degree of belief, and we can have a degree of warranted belief, which would be certainly something we're not in position to measure now, but you can imagine a measure being worked out somehow in terms of the multitude of hypotheses that would imply this thing if they were true, or would imply it anyway, whether they're true or not. But the degree to which they've been more or less confirmed indirectly by direct confirmation of other hypotheses that follow from them. We can and do make rough estimates of comparative warrant without having to find it, but I don't think it's indefinable. I think it's just vague and unsystematic.
How would you be able to determine a legitimate skeptical inquiry or a skeptic's inquiry from a legitimate doubt? Assuming that we both ascribe to the given theory, I accept that. We're all within the general theory that we accept, which is science. We now have someone who presents to us something that goes completely counter to everything that we seem to know within our theory seems to be the case.
Yes. Well, now, good. Now, this should be a situation where, well, you're wondering how I would decide whether this man's really in doubt, or whether it's a skeptical doubt for the sake of...
There's a fine line, it seems to me. When I talked earlier in our interview, there's a fine line sometimes between what constitutes fanaticism and what constitutes skepticism. It largely depends upon what and how people look at the particular doubt that's being presented. Now, I just want to know, how do we determine whether this is indeed we're confronted with a fanatical skeptic, or whether we're confronted with someone who seriously is in doubt about this issue?
Well, it would be a psychological judgment, and there would be manifestations that we would think were indicative of one rather than the other. We would think, or we might think in terms of the sorts of considerations that might plausibly be leading him to doubt this thing. And if we find it altogether too hard to imagine what those might be, we'll suspect him of a feigned doubt in the way of skepticism.
So you'd ultimately have to face the tribunal, as it were.
We would, yes. Yes, a fair chunk of it, perhaps.
Right. Okay.
Professor Quine, I had one more question about responses to skepticism about the external world. That's, it concerns the use of the principles which would govern radical translation or radical interpretation, the use of those principles to try to give a global response to radical skepticism. Perhaps the idea I have in mind is associated more with Donald Davidson than with yourself, but I'd like to hear what you have to say about it. What do you think of the idea that the principle of charity, which says, roughly speaking, so interpret the other to make him or her come out true by and large, what do you think of the idea that the principle of charity gives us a response to skepticism? After all, if the only way to interpret people is so that they come out true by and large, they're not going to be wrong about most things.
Yes, that's certainly Don Davidson's answer to skepticism, as I get it. Well, I don't subscribe precisely to the principle of charity. What I think should guide us is the principle of psychological plausibility. If we have observed in this alien society some outlandish ceremonies and rites and taboos, it may be more plausible to construe his sentence in such a way that it comes out false, but chimes in with his other apparent strange ideas, and so that we could be misled by applying the principle of charity. But on the other hand, this coincides, this psychological approach coincides over a wide area with the principle of charity in that people are so much alike. And even these exotic natives, when it comes to ordinary practical things, or the way, I guess it's the Azande, according to Evans Pritchard, that put so much store in magic, but they only apply, they make ordinary causal, we're told by him, ordinary causal statements and causal explanations, very much the way we do, common sense, and magic comes in only in cases that we would say are practically unpredictable. It's luck, it's coincidence. We don't have an explanation. They bring in magic to explain it. Even these people, on the whole, we would come out pretty well by taking each of their sentences to be something that's true by our lights.
Right. But still, the principle interprets so as to maximize intelligibility, what some people call the principle of humanity. That principle, rather than the principle interprets so as to maximize truth, looks like a more plausible principle, but the price you pay is that it robs you of a way of responding to skepticism.
Yes, yes.
Which you didn't particularly want anyway.
That's right, yes.
Right. What a happy circumstance.
Confronted with a pair of alternative theories, you said that the way to decide which one of them, if any, to accept is to compare their predictions with the observable facts. But suppose we're faced with a couple of competing theories that make the same observable predictions and that are equally simple. here we would have a case of what you've called underdetermination of theory by data. What do you think is the right policy in this situation? Which of the theories ought we to believe, if any?
Well, there are three three possibilities I should begin with. One, that the theories are simply intertranslatable. That's not interesting. Intertranslatable and both coming out as saying, one going completely into the other and vice versa, so that it's just really the same theory in that, in an intuitive sense of the word. But second, there's a case where the two theories are incompatible, and yet they're empirically equivalent. And that can happen because the incompatibility can be in the theoretical sentences. There's a way of eliminating that alternative I got a hint of this from Davidson years ago, namely, if there's logical conflict between the two theories, it means that there will be a sentence, there will be many, but in particular there will be a sentence of which the one theory affirms and the other denies. That surely then is a highly theoretical sentence, because it can't be closely connected with test cases, since the theories are empirically equivalent. So it will contain some theoretical term or two, highly theoretical. We can resolve the conflict by treating that term as two different terms, maybe change the spelling of one of them in the two theories, because after all it's a theoretical term that hasn't been pinned down by empirical criteria. We're free to do this. If we do that right across the board, every time there's another inconsistency, we do the same trick. We end up by reconciling the theories. So this reduces all three cases now to one. And this is a case where you have two theories that are empirically equivalent and are not intertranslatable, not sentence by sentence. You might say, well, the whole theory is a translation of the whole theory. But they are compatible. Yes, not intertranslatable. If there are theories that have been rendered compatible by Davidson's device, this means that they're not entirely in the same language. There are some theoretical terms of the one that aren't translatable into the other, and vice versa. And so here's the real case then that I think presents the problem. What do we do about it? If the theories were if the theories were in the same language and were consistent, I would say just throw them together, because I wouldn't think of this as a loss of economy. I think of this rather as an enrichment, because the sentences are the same, and insofar as the theoretical sentences of the one theory differ from as the ones that are accepted in the one theory are not accepted in the other. But still, the whole things are empirically equivalent. Take those in. Enrichment in that now some more of our theoretical sentences, which were hanging fire, we hadn't decided whether they're true or false, we can now say they're true. So I'd like that. I'd like that. So the one case that remains is the case of empirically equivalent but mutually incompatible theories, and incompatible now because they have some untranslatable words. The line I've vacillated on this question, but the one that I seem to have settled down to for some time now is we don't want to say, and here, Davidson would say, well, call them both true. I don't want to do that because truth applies only to a language. I think of Tarski's construction of truth. It's the sentences that are true. So that, in that sense, you have to say true for language L, because the same string of words might have quite another use in another language. We can't, when we do apply truth, the predicate truth, to sentences in another language, what we're really saying is our translation of that sentence into our language by our choice of a translation manual is true. But in this case of these two competing theories, the one language is not translatable into the other. Therefore, our truth concept does not extend to it. And the way we can absorb that situation, accommodate it, is to say, well, those sentences with those odd terms in it are meaningless. We can't say whether they're true or false. They're meaningless. It doesn't apply. Our truth predicate doesn't apply. We have no translation. So that's the way I leave it, that when the situation has been reduced, as we can reduce it, just to that case that has the alien terms in it, say, well, it's we can still see, perhaps by some indirect methods, that the empirical, the relation to observation sentences are the same. They're empirically equivalent. And so, yes, well, that's good theory. That's just as warranted, apparently, as our theory is. But we can't say it's true because it's meaningless. It's got this gibberish in it. And we can say that and still, having satisfied ourselves with the empirical equivalence, go over into the other theory when we please, pursue that theory for the further enrichment, further perspective on reality that it's giving us. And then, of course, as long as we're over there, we're saying, sure, that's true. This other theory that we just left behind is the one that's meaningless. But it's true for L prime, not true for L.
Let me see if I understand the answer. We have the two theory formulations. They're empirically equivalent. They're not intertranslatable. We've removed any syntactic inconsistency by changing terms. We don't want to just think of them as both in our language, conjoin them, and as it were, believe the conjunction, because then we would have a theory that's too bloated and too...
That's right. State economy.
So we have to make some... So we must make some choice between them. Now we can think of them as theories formulated in different languages. Is this what you're saying? Then we can perhaps arbitrarily decide to use one of the languages, that is one of the theories. And from that perspective, the theory formulation in the other language, well, perhaps we shouldn't say that it's meaningless. It has a meaning in this other language that we can't translate.
Yeah.
It's as simple as that.
Yeah.
I think I...
So what's saving the situation, as I see it, is that truth, since I'm taking truth, following Tarski, as an attribute of sentences,
Yeah.
is necessarily relative to a language.
Yes.
And that hasn't persuaded Davidson, but seems to me to stand up.
Yes. Let me ask you a final question on underdetermination to take us back to what we were talking about before. Do you think of the skeptical hypotheses, such as the hypothesis that we're dreaming or the hypothesis that we're brains in the vat, as would you assimilate the problem of deciding whether such hypotheses are true rather than the common sense hypothesis to the problem of underdetermination? Are these examples of hypotheses that purport to explain the data, namely the facts of our experience, just as well as the hypothesis, the common sense hypothesis that we are awake and living in a real physical world?
I think we'd find a basis for choice in terms of simplicity and economy of theory.
One of the main concerns of traditional epistemology has been to solve the problem first posed by David Hume. What reason do we have to make the assumption that the future will resemble the past? And this appears to be a very important assumption that we make. It seems to presuppose a lot of our activity in everyday life as well as in scientific research, and it certainly would be nice, perhaps, and very important to find a justification for making that assumption. But on this issue you've written, and I quote, "The Humean predicament is the human predicament." What do you have in mind here?
Yes, I don't think it can be done. A logical justification of the principle of induction is possible. But at the same time, nothing could be more fundamental to science and everyday life than induction. In its most primitive form, it governs animals generally, at least the higher ones, and it's the basis of habit formation. It's our innate standard of similarity, which underlies all our habit formation and expectation, namely expecting that a sensory experience similar by our lights, our similarity standards, to an earlier one will have a sequel similar to the sequel of the earlier one. There's the basic principle, as I think of it, of induction, and it's the basis of expectation. So we wouldn't be getting anywhere, even learning the beginnings of language, or learning how to get around, if we wouldn't have any conditioned responses if it weren't for that. So that's fundamental. And then, from a naturalistic point of view, there is still the question, however, not of justification, except after the fact. Why is it that it works so well? Because we're certainly doing a fine job of, our expectations come out so much, and similarly for other animals, so much more successfully than random. This surely is to be explained by our standards of similarity, subjective similarity, which underlie this basic form of induction, and our standards of similarity in that sense, the things that we respond similarly to, have the same response to these presentations, similar in that sense. That standard of similarity is instilled in us by natural selection down the generations. Its survival value lies in the fact that it does correspond to the trends in nature, at least the trends in nature up to that time that have been affecting us, so that our expectations are fulfilled so much more often than not. That therefore is the ex post facto explanation of why induction works. It's not a justification of induction. That would be a vicious circle. But it explains why it's worked up to now. It gives us no assurance that it's going to go on working. There could be an abrupt change in the affairs of the world. But we expect it is going to go on working for the same reason. We're applying our same old pattern of expectation, expecting the past to be pretty much reproduced in the future.
So you see nothing awkward or embarrassing in the fact that this fundamental principle that we need to assume can't be justified. All that can be done is that we can explain why following it is successful, but we can't actually justify it. We can't provide any grounds for making that assumption.
No, and I think it's also that's what I meant by the Humean predicament being the human predicament. I think we have to settle for that, and it's of a piece with recognizing the fallibility of science generally.
In your explanation, you make use of the notion of similarity, and you use the phrase subjective similarity.
Yeah.
And I think I know what you have in mind. There can't be an objective sense of similarity because of this Goodman problem that everything is similar to everything else.
Yeah.
But can you say more about what you mean by a subjective probability?
Well, yes. In principle, it can be tested by conditioned responses. The creature happens to do something. That's operant behavior, as Skinner calls it. Just shortly after, some stimulation has been given him, and then you reward that. I call it, hardly say response, but that bit of operant behavior, you reward it. And then, because of this primitive induction, the creature expects that reward again when he responds in that way to a similar experience. Well, now, this can be used for a psychological measurement, in principle, of the creature's standards of similarity and degrees of similarity. By giving him another stimulation, having rewarded his that response of his to the first stimulation, having rewarded that, give him another stimulation similar to the first, similar by the this time by the experimenter standard, of course, but not very similar. Just reasonably, and the creature responds the same old way, and you penalize him instead of rewarding him. And then you try a third stimulation, which is, you're wondering, is this third going to be more similar for that creature to the first than it was to the second? And you decide that by whether he responds or doesn't respond in the way that he had to the first two. If he does respond in spite of the punishment, it means that it's more similar to the first than to the second. So this is so subjective similarity, in short, turns out to be something that does make experimental and scientific sense, unlike absolute similarity in the abstract.
I have a sort of inchoate question about the evolutionary argument, the evolutionary explanation of the accuracy of our expectations. It seems plausible that this might explain the accuracy of primitive expectations. Do you think the same sort of evolutionary argument can be used to explain why we're so successful in science? Why we manage to hit on profound theories of the world that work so well?
I think it must be the same principle, and I think this isn't just a happy accident, that we've been guided by the expectations from this most primitive level onward in elaborating our science. And when the expectations induced by primitive induction don't pan out, we back up and discard that hypothesis, so that we're using the same old the same old primitive reaction, primitive apparatus of expectation, I think, right along. The difference is that we're building a more and more sophisticated structure to which to apply it.
I want to ask a question that's related to a paper that you wrote called On the Nature of Moral Values, which I think may relate to this question too. In the Nature of Moral Values, you outline the two parts, as it were, to the way that we learn these responses or become conditioned. There's the first part, which seems to go along two axes. One is that you are rewarded by pain or avoidance of pain, or pleasure or avoidance of pleasure, or pain and pleasure. And that goes along one axis. Then there's the further aspect, which is the concept of similarity. Now, similarity is a sort of triadic relationship, I think,
Yes.
In the sense that something is, A has to be better than B, more like B than C,
That's
right? And then you're saying that, in answer to what Bob was saying, that this, in fact, is something that is actually the way in which we learn our science as well, because ultimately this is our primitive equipment. Okay. Now, you were using that as an explanation as how, in fact, we evolve that's how our moral theory or our morality would evolve. And earlier, you seemed to want to say that moral values as such was something that was slightly, well, was different from the way in which we come to our knowledge about the world, or engage or develop or construct our scientific theory. Now, I'm not exactly clear still, that's why I keep coming back to it, precisely what the difference is.
Yes, good. Now let's see, how can that be sorted out? In the first place, I think of course, our moral training has, the development of our moral values in the individual has two sources. I think one, there's the innate part, the kind of thing that accounts for altruism among animals, other animals as well. Second, there's the part that in animals is seen by training a dog or training a dog to do tricks, and training a child to behave. Well, now it's the same old subjective standard of similarity that applies to both. In the one case, I use this in showing how to test the standard of similarity itself. And that was already the animal training kind of situation. And you're discouraging the action. Then there was that further step in, if we're trying to measure similarity. But in the case of training behavior, we're doing the same thing for a different purpose this time, namely just to discourage that thing once and for all. Is there any further connection? I think that's what the moral side and the scientific side have in common. On the moral side, there is, then you see, this primitive scientific element involved, namely, I mean, insofar as you might say that induction or expectation is the primitive germ of science, namely, that is exploited in moral training.
I wanted to take us to the difference between descriptive and normative questions about our practice of rational inquiry, particularly our reasoning practices. It's very easy to see how within the project of epistemology naturalized we would be concerned with the question, how do people actually reason? How do people actually arrive at judgments? And we know what kind of inquiry this would be, we know what kind of evidence would be involved. And when we have some data about our actual reasoning practice, we also know that we could perhaps give an evolutionary explanation of why we go in for that kind of practice. It's because the people who didn't go in for that kind of practice didn't get to have any babies. But there's another kind of question, which is how ought we to reason? And in fact, these come apart quite sharply. We can certainly imagine that when we do the investigation of our actual reasoning practice, we come up with answers where we want to say, you see our actual reasoning practice is that we tend to make mistakes in this kind of area. And indeed, there might even be an evolutionary explanation as to why. It's no bad thing to make a mistake in that kind of area. A popular example, it doesn't concern reasoning, but it's another kind of judgment. It might just be adaptive to underestimate the distance from you to a predator, for example. Makes you run all the harder, which means that not only do you escape, but you build up very firm thigh muscles. Now, the question for you is this: what kind of argument, what kind of argument or evidence could be relevant, not to the question how we do reason, but the question how we should reason?
Good. And certainly there is serious reasoning that goes on that is fallacious. I think of the gambler's fallacy. And again, of course, there's wishful thinking. So our recognizing these as fallacies is a matter of scientific progress. We've observed the failures. That's one way. Just empirically find those that this is a bad line to take. What we actually do is try to break down the considerations logically, and in the face of what seems to be a reasonable sort of, so to speak, primitive statistical theory, see why certain things, certain ways of reasoning should succeed as they do, and we don't see why, in the case of the gambler's fallacy, why a bad run of luck should be followed by a good turn of luck any more than otherwise, and so that's where engineering, scientific engineering comes in, the engineering of the scientific process.
Let me just get this clear. It might be, I suppose, that it turns out that people who engage in the gambler's fallacy have a happy life and have more children than other people. Supposing that that were so, that would no more make the gambler's fallacy correct reasoning than that we indeed take it to be. It would still be a fallacy. Be a fallacy measured against some norms. Now, the account of norms, as I understand it, is being given in terms of engineering principles. I wonder if you could just say a little bit more about that.
Yes, good, because I think that if this happened, we would be changing our norms. And I think the norms here are like the norms in building bridges. And they're learned partly by trial and error, partly by scientific theories, reasoning, systematic reasoning on the basis of hypotheses which in bundles have been more or less checked by experiment. In short, I think that the norms of a epistemological kind are applied cognitive judgments, just as the norms in engineering of bridges are.
Right. Let me just make sure I've gotten this part right. The idea is that if a certain pattern of reasoning which we currently take as fallacious were to turn out to lead to people having happier lives and more babies, then the norms would change and it would no longer be correct to describe that reasoning as fallacious. Is that the view?
Yes, I think that's what I would say. Since it's such an unexpected turn of affairs, it might take us a while to be persuaded of it.
Right.
And then certainly we wouldn't be satisfied until we'd gone on and worked out in a more or less partly logical way, why that was.
I'm puzzled about how it turns out that that norms in the area of behavior, ethical norms, are treated in your philosophy in such a different way from norms in the area of epistemology. In the case of ethics, you said that normative claims weren't a part of, couldn't be part of a naturalistic inquiry because there wasn't any way of verifying them. In effect, I suppose what it comes to is acknowledging the gulf between ought and is. There isn't any way for a statement about what ought to be done to have observable consequences.
I think that's right. I think they're different. I think they're different.
Why isn't the same thing true for statements about how we ought to think?
I think the difference is this, that norms concerning how we ought to think are like the norms of building dependable bridges, namely they're norms that are derivative from declarative statements, findings, established, so we think, sufficiently established scientific hypotheses, laws, about the behavior of these materials. In the case of the ethical norms, I think there are no corresponding cognitive judgments. There are for some of for the subsidiary ethical norms, yes, but those are cognitive judgments that relate the consequences of some action to the consequences of another action, which is governed, ruled out, or approved by irreducibly ethical norm. So that it's the relation to subsidiary cognitive judgments that seems to me makes the difference.
Take an epistemological norm such as assume that the future will resemble the past, a principle we were talking about earlier. What cognitive judgments is that related to?
Well, now this is a you might say a cognitive judgment that has been sustained by induction. In this case, it's an induction on inductions. We've had this long experience of having things turn out pretty much the way they turned out before. Therefore, we expect them to do so again. This is almost the same as the old fallacious effort to justify induction. Well, it doesn't justify induction, but I think it explains the judgment.
You've said that one of the bases of your entire philosophy is your naturalism, your belief that science is the only road to knowledge. I wonder if you have some way of characterizing knowledge. The problem I'm concerned with is this, that if knowledge is itself defined as the products of science, then naturalism, the thesis of naturalism, turns into an empty stipulation. In saying, let me just clarify, in saying that that science is the only way to knowledge, we would be saying that science is the only way to give us the products of science.
The only way
to give us the products of science. If knowledge is defined as whatever science produces.
I think it does come to pretty much that. What it excludes is revelation. I wouldn't say it excludes. I wouldn't say it excludes telepathy. That's just one of the fallible scientific findings, that telepathy is impossible. It doesn't work, that is to say, and maybe it does. But Yes, I would agree with you that that natural, intuitive way of putting naturalism, and certainly very likely the exact way I've done it, is rough and raises question. In the first place, the very notion of knowledge, I think, is a questionable notion. Knowledge has to be true according to usage, and science and our warranted beliefs generally are fallible. I think, well, here again we have the situation where paradoxically the theory of knowledge has come up with the conclusion that there's no such thing as knowledge. But the game of science, it seems to me, is characterized. Its distinguishing feature is direct or indirect testability by observation.
So are you saying implicitly that perhaps a better formulation of naturalism would be as a normative principle, which says, don't believe anything unless it's reached by the scientific method?
Well, good. Of course, I would subscribe to that normative principle. Maybe it's arbitrary whether we include that as part of what goes with the word naturalism. It certainly would be the naturalist attitude.
Your response, I think, to Paul was to say that by all means knowledge can be, perhaps by stipulation, limited to the products of science, and you even accepted this normative principle. Where does that leave the possibility of knowledge about ethics, knowledge about political matters, knowledge about culinary matters, knowledge about musical and literary matters? Indeed, if the putative science of intentional psychology is in as bad shape as you rather suspect it is, even knowledge of everyday psychological matters would seem to be threatened by what began looking like a pretty innocent piece of agreement between the two of you. So could you just clarify whether we really can live with the idea that we shouldn't form any beliefs about these matters and certainly can't attain any knowledge about these matters?
No, what I accept rather is the gradations of justified belief, and of course all sorts of gradations in the vagueness of a statement. And I consider furthermore that most of what we accept and what I accept as true, pending information to the contrary, the sort of thing that certainly can't be directly tested by observation, by deducing an observation categorical. I think a great deal of it, if not overwhelming part of it, is not even indirectly testable in the sense of that you could add this hypothesis to another bundle of hypotheses that would make the difference of critical mass. But that all these are worthwhile. They're reasonable beliefs. They fill out the picture. They suggest further hypotheses which can be tested. The point about the test, the empirical element in all of this, for me, is just that insofar as there is test, it's that.
Right. I wonder whether anything is resting on the term science. You spoke then of the empirical element, and the idea might be don't form beliefs unless you can somehow incorporate those beliefs into some network of empirical questions. There might be some version of a normative principle. But what was actually on offer, I think, was don't form beliefs unless they're arrived at by the scientific method. Now, reading somebody's biography and arriving at some conclusion about their psychological state is arriving at a claim which is empirical and has testable consequences, but it's hardly arriving at a claim via the scientific method, I suppose.
Yes, I think that's a good objection. Yeah. Yes, that's certainly a bad way of putting it, arrived at by scientific method. yes, it's rather that that should be regarded as the limit, the ultimate in making something acceptable and virtually undeniable. The test is the only kind of the test by observation is the only kind of test that can be asked or can be claimed for these things, but by no means can we limit our beliefs to what we can subject to such tests. They should fit into the whole overall picture, which, insofar as it is sustained by evidence, is sustained in just that way at the periphery.
Yes, I notice your naturalism excludes revelation, which is. I've also noticed that although we keep inviting you to produce something like a transcendental argument, you always refuse. You seem never to take that style. Would it be fair to say that one characterization of your naturalism is just a decision not to use transcendental arguments? Do you commit them anywhere?
No, I think it's part of the concept of naturalism.
Yeah, reject it. Yes, I think that's what sets your response about skepticism apart from so many other people. For example, Davidson is not to make a transcendental move on it at all. Indeed, I don't know a single time today you've used such an argument. And I think that's, in some ways, is a rather interesting way of characterizing your position. That if you're an empiricist, you really are. And there aren't ever any backup transcendental arguments that are going to be brought in. You certainly didn't use a transcendental argument for induction, for example, which is which Strawson does. Just at no point do you do it. And I think that might be one way of responding to the question, what constitutes the naturalism?
I think that's good, yes.
Yeah.
Down with transcendental arguments.
Yeah, yeah.